What I will first do is introduce our wonderful speaker, Rebecca. Dr. Birrell is a research affiliate at the Fitzwilliam Museum, where she was curator of 19th and 20th century paintings and drawings between 2001 and 2023.
Not that long, Hannah.
Sorry. She curated the rehang of galleries 1 to 5 that opened in March 2024. And if any of you haven't seen them yet, I urge you to rush over to Cambridge when you can. She's currently a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow at the University of St Andrews, and her first book, This Dark Country, Women Artists, Still Life and Intimacy in the Early 20th Century, was published by Bloomsbury in 2021. This Dark Country was a Guardian Observer Art Book of the Year and was also longlisted for the William Berger Prize for British Art History in 2022, amongst numerous other accolades. Prior to her PhD, Dr. Birrell occupied curatorial positions at the Charleston Trust, the British Museum, and she undertook a fellowship at the Yale Centre for British Art, which is where I had the good fortune of meeting her in 2018. She continues to work on curatorial projects and write regularly for exhibition catalogues. This includes the lead essay for Vanessa Bell, A World of Form and Colour, which is now on at the MK1 Gallery, and it opened last month. She also has an essay on Gwen John's Nudes, which will form part of the retrospective on John's work, opening at the National Museum Wales in 2026. So in a couple of years. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Rebecca now.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah. And sorry for interrupting the bio. I want to make clear that I was not working at the Fitzwilliam Museum for 20 years. That would make me extremely precocious. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this talk. And thank you so much to Dr. Hannah Lyons, a curator I admire so much. And I'm fortunate to call my friend. Thank you so much for this invite. It's really lovely to do this. So today I'm going to be talking about a drawing in the collection at the University of Reading by Gwen John. And I'm going to use this to talk more broadly about John's relationship to the nude as a genre. So first of all, because I don't presume that everyone knows who Gwen John is, I'm going to talk about who Gwen John is. So Gwen John was born in Wales in 1876 and was educated at the Slade School of Art in London between 1895 and 1898. She moved to Paris not intending to stay for long, but ended up spending most of her working life there, living in the city and its suburbs, where she died a couple of weeks after the declaration of the Second World War in September 1939. Her life was completely devoted to her art. She wasn't particularly interested in exhibition and sale. She had one very strong relationship with an American collector and patron called John Quinn and his wife, but that really wasn't the kind of focus of her work. She saw painting as a kind of spiritual vocation. And indeed, later in her life, she converted to Catholicism in 1913 and really threw herself into religious life in the suburbs of Paris. And that was where her kind of attention was, I think, with painting and with God. But to get a kind of sense of her body of work and of its style and the tradition she was working in and where her nudes kind of fit within this, I'm just going to start by looking at this painting interior with figures from 1899. So this is one of her earliest works, only a year out of art school. And it shows two of John's friends from art school, Ida Nettleship and Gwen Salmond, in the rooms that they shared in Paris. They're huddled together reading a book with light streaming through an open window. This is a space that's centered around intimacy, friendship, and intellectual enrichment. This is not a cozy and fussily Victorian domestic space crammed full of objects and responsibilities. There's a kind of amazing contrast in the painting between these very austere rooms and the very colorful clothing that they're wearing, the Ida Nettleship's red hair. But these weren't contemporary clothing. This is sort of a costume. It's almost like fancy dress. The women were all very interested in fashion, and Nettleship's mother worked with theatrical costumes. So there's also a sense of kind of play and fantasy intertwined with the act of reading. So this is what freedom looked like to women of John's generation, who were amongst the first permitted to live independently prior to marriage. who are benefiting from the expansion of urban centres like Paris and the sudden availability of rented rooms and boarding houses. This feels like a fresh, modern understanding of a young woman's life at the turn of the century. In many ways, this is a kind of snapshot into John's life at this time. But the woman reader was also an established motif. And I think it's very interesting and very relevant to what I'm going to talk about with the nudes, that even in this very early stage of her career, she's only 23 years old, John was very much putting herself in dialogue with a kind of history of images. She was showing her immersion in the history of painting, but also kind of subtly subverting it. And so to kind of give you a sense of what that looks like, here are two, I would say, relatively typical examples of how women readers were depicted in the centuries before. And John would have known these images, and if not known these images exactly, would have known images very like these. So in Fragonard's painting, the one on the left, there's a real sense of frivolity. The books are very careworn if you look closely. There's a sense of feminine excess and feminine carelessness. The ripples on the gown echo the creased paper. This is, in other words, unserious reading. By contrast, the Vermeer, who I think is an extremely important touchstone for John, reading is introspective, it's quiet, it seals the woman off from the world and acts as a kind of metaphor for interiority. And while I think that interiority is very important for John as well, I think that there's so much more kind of pleasure and aliveness in John's 1899 example. And there would be many more examples, because this figure of the reader would recur throughout her career, and it became the motif that really she comes back to again and again. Again, these early paintings of D'Aurelia McNeill in Toulouse, then these two self-portraits, very obviously influenced by Vermeer, but also influenced by religious paintings, the Annunciation. There isn't space to talk about this now, but something that I am really interested in is how these images of reading are always themselves very interested in religious art and are full of borrowings from its kind of symbols and images. And here's just one example of this very simple looking painting, and I think the kind of complex way it's thinking about the history of a woman reading a book. And of course, there are the later paintings, The Convalescent. This was part of a very long series of works, and this is just examples of versions of this that are in public collections in the UK. So talking about readers before I talk about nudes, this might not seem very intuitive, but if you look at John's body of work as a whole, it's clear she was very interested in showing a woman thinking, a woman developing a sense of herself intellectually and ethically through reading, a woman becoming through reading. And this preoccupation filled her work as much as it filled her life. And it's evident throughout her journals, which are this mix of kind of diaristic writing, but are full of kind of copied out passages from a broad range of literature and philosophy. So it might not be that surprising that there are all of these paintings that show women reading, but out of the 158 known oil paintings, there are only 2 nudes, 3 if you count an unfinished study amongst them, which I think most people don't. But what I would like to argue is that I think John saw the nudes as continuous with these images of women reading. She had the same ambitions for these paintings, basically. I think that for her, the nudes remained representations of women thinking. And I think that John wanted to expand and remake the nude as a vehicle for further exploration of women's selves, their thoughts, their dreams, their desires. And I think that this was quite radical and certainly a very different aim to the nude in terms of what it was made to express traditionally. So let's return to this drawing in the University of Reading collection. The sketch is undated and it forms the verso of a clothed seated woman. So on the front is the clothed seated woman, on the back is the nude. And when Hannah first showed this to me, this really excited me because it reflects a pattern that I've identified in John's only known nudes. They're all either partnered with a closely related canvas of a clothed woman, or like this drawing, they form the verso of a canvas of a clothed woman. So here they all are. Here's the spread of them. I'm going to come back to these obviously in much greater detail, but as you can see, just from looking at these all together, John seems unsatisfied with the nude as a discrete object. Why this need always to have a clothed counterpart? One explanation has to do with this impulse in John that I've mentioned already, this speaking back to art history, and as a woman artist, the nude is particularly contentious ground. But I also think there's a rejection in these paintings of the narrowness of the nude as a genre, a refusal to reduce a woman to her body and to insist instead upon a kind of fuller sense of the sitter's subjectivity. So these two known finished nude paintings by John are Nude Girl from 1910 and Seated Nude from 1924. They are 15 years apart and represent two very different moments in her development as an artist. Nude Girl feels much more 19th century. You can still feel Whistler's influence very much. It's obviously more kind of realist. Whereas the Seated Nude, with its flattened perspective, the opaque blocks of color, is much more a product of modernism. And even just years of osmosis, living in Paris, seeing all of these kind of developments, you can kind of see the evolution of John over this time in these two paintings. But given the nude was a critical site of experiment for ambitious early 20th century artists, John's apparent disinterest in the genre is striking. John was no doubt constrained by the belief that painting the nude was morally dangerous for women. In 1930, writing about her sister, the painter Vanessa Bell, Virginia Woolf describes how, quote, "It was held until 60 years ago for a woman to look upon nakedness with the eye of an artist and not simply with the eye of a mother, wife, or mistress, was corruptive of her innocence and destructive of her domesticity." It's interesting that Woolf locates these restrictions in the past, 60 years ago, because clearly these assumptions had not entirely lifted, given Bell herself, her small output of nudes. And in this, in the show at Milton Keynes, which I urge everyone to go see, you do see a handful of nudes that Bell did, but Bell, like many of her British female contemporaries, just wasn't really as prolific in that genre. And I wrote a book about many of these artists, not just Bell and John, but also Dora Carrington, Gluck, Nina Hamnet, Ethel Sands. And it's remarkable how much that is a kind of shared thing. None of them are really interested in painting nudes. A notable exception to this is the Scottish artist Ethel Walker, who primarily painted nudes and was almost exactly contemporary with all of these artists. And there are really interesting reasons why this might be, why she seemed to completely transgress, I suppose, these moral constraints, but that's another talk for another time. So the Slade School of Art, where John enrolled in 1895, was unusually progressive in allowing female students access to the life model when most British art schools prohibited them from painting the nude. I think this is something to kind of emphasize that for a very long time, well into the 20th century, most art schools in the UK wouldn't let women in the same room as nude models. And even at the Slade, I think John would have experienced the sort of lingering sense of the nude's moral riskiness. Classes were gender segregated as though to forestall eruptions of desire. Women were only permitted to draw from undressed female models, not male ones who were draped. And this is why for many women in John's position, and this is partly what my book is about, still life became much more of interest to them. Still life was considered consistent with the domestic life. It was encouraged in women. It was considered sort of appropriately feminine. It was kind of unthreatening and unsexy. It's interesting that someone like Gluck responded directly to this in their erotic flower paintings, which actually only slightly predate those of Georgia O'Keeffe. If you can't paint the nude, then you can infuse the genre that is available to you with the eroticism of the nude. So despite all of these constraints, and it's interesting that it did take her until 1909 to paint a nude, so 10 years after she left art school, her first no nude was 1909. Nude Girl was modeled by the artist model, Fenella Lovell. The grey-blue wall matches the shawl draped over her lower body, accentuating the contrast between pale, luminous flesh and its surroundings. The art historian Linda Need argues that the female nude in Western art sought to contain and regulate the female sexual body, and one way to suggest this disempowerment visually was to pose women in a recline. By contrast, Lovell has an active stance, her erect posture exaggerated by foreshortening. It's true that John would paint most portraits clothed and unclothed in this upright seated pose. Here are some examples. But unclothed, this pose was a powerful, even if inadvertent, rejection of the passivity of the traditional female nude. A shift from horizontality to verticality subverts the binary of male domination and female submission that historically structured the relation between male artist and female model. So an instance of this, a very famous instance of this, is Diego Velázquez's The Toilet of Venus, 1647, otherwise known as the Rokeby Venus, which John saw at London's National Gallery. And this really exemplifies the use of the recline to objectify the female body. The sitter's torso is as smooth and soft as the silk her body is stretched out upon. The musculature of her back is carefully detailed, her face blurred in a handheld mirror. So there's an extreme version of this, but I think it's all on the same continuum, where the reclining nude is linked not only to passivity, but to a kind of openness to violation and violence. And it's in this Titian painting of the rape of Lucretia. So it shows you how close the nude comes in history to eroticizing violence. And I think that this was part of the kind of longer, broader historical context in which John's nude situated itself and was a kind of intervention, a sort of necessary reimagining of the nude's power dynamics. And I think that partly what influenced John to do this was a kind of an awareness of these paintings, spending a lot of time when she was at art school, going to galleries, seeing these works. But another sort of extraordinary thing was that she modeled nude herself. And we know from her letters that she continued to model nude while she was even painting this painting of Lovell, an experience which, Renaissance artists never had, and male artists that were working in Paris at the same time as John never had. And I think that this gave her a really direct experience of the genre's kind of active-passive dichotomy, and perhaps gave her a real desire to overcome it. So the representation of Lovell is also in marked opposition to a kind of feminine sensuality in the nude that's characterized by voluptuous curves, jewels and fur, colored cheeks and lips. And this is sort of the woman as a kind of commodity with a male owner spectator in mind. This Titian is a kind of fabulous over-the-top example of this. So Lovell, just scrolling between those two images, it could not be more different than this. Her collarbone and ribs are visible. Her thinness is underscored by the length of a simple necklace that echoes her body's narrowness. Her hair is cropped. Her face is bare of makeup. Lovell's small silver cross, a highly unusual detail for a nude, sets her nakedness apart from the objectification typical of the genre. As John Berger argues, the ideal of the Renaissance nude was challenged in the late 19th century by the introduction of sort of unflinching, sordid representations of sex workers. But I think that John is here proposing her own reworking of the nude that imagines the body as a site of spiritual as well as sexual meaning. So Nude Girl, for me, is sort of thematizing ideas about purity and grace, and it's thinking about those things against the backdrop of the nude. John converted to Catholicism in 1913, as I mentioned, and she spent a lot of time reading and copying out theological texts. The archive at the National Library of Wales is sort of full of these kind of fascinating readings, her own readings of theological texts. And so I think that this sort of represents the kind of the undressed body as representing a soul primed for contact with the divine. And this sort of reflects a Christian theological affirmation of embodiment as a fundamental way through which the faithful relate to God, that God has sort of given you the body through which you experience the world and through which you access God. And I think that John saw the body in those terms very much. So rather like with the readers, I'd encourage you to think of this nude as being part of a kind of broader project in John's work that's about faith and women and how that might be expressed and lived. And it sort of fits in with work that she did later in her career, which was these incredible series of paintings of nuns. I particularly like this drawing in the British Museum, which is the only instance in which a nun is smiling in all of these paintings. So back to this, back to the Nude Girl. So John's Nude Girl has been interpreted as exposing tensions between the model and the artist. And this is based on a series of letters that John wrote to Ursula Tirrett, an artist, in the spring of 1910. And this is just one of the examples of things she said, quote, "It's a great strain doing Fenella. It's a pretty little face, but she is dreadful." And dreadful is italicized. And even in the take caption online to Nude Girl, the sort of focus of the label is to kind of recapitulate this myth, I think, that there was this great animosity between these two women. I'd like to argue that Nude Girl might instead be understood as reflecting John's relationship to the nude as a genre mired in patriarchal power, as evidence of artistic struggles rather than interpersonal squabbles, those which are especially easy to focus on when they're between women. John used Lovell as a model in a second portrait from the same year, which suggests that their working relationship couldn't have been that bad. Almost identical in its composition, Girl with Bare Shoulders shows Lovell dressed in a white chemise with a large black bow, rather than simply accessorized with a necklace and a shawl. The pair of paintings together deflate a kind of guiding fantasy of the genre. Reduced to mythological figures, such as in the Rokeby Venus, a woman's purpose is narrowed to the horizons of male pleasure and male violence. She is her body, her sexuality, and fertility, little more. John, however, dresses Lovell in outmoded romantic clothing that reconfigures her as a kind of ingenue, and seen together with the confident, quietly erotic nude, she suggests the different guises of femininity available to a woman. Casting Lovell in distinct feminine roles, John evokes the interplay of fantasy and self-fashioning at the heart of new constructions of female identity. So in giving her model this kind of space to be reinvented across these two canvases, John expands the nude genre so it might contain the multiplicities of its female protagonist. 15 years passed. The lack of precedent for the nude John aspired to paint is evident in how closely the nude of 1924 echoes that of 1909. The model wears a long chain with a small pendant that falls between her breasts, with a dark blue shawl against her lower body. So the dressing of the 1924 nude, in other words, corresponds very closely to that of 1909. However, as mentioned, John's style has sort of shifted by 1915. Light, shadow, and figurative detail are pared back, paint appears dry and opaque. And as I said, I think this has something to do with John's kind of deeper engagement with modernist art. And this kind of modernist technique flattens the nude figure against the ground and emphasizes artifice in a way that, again, undercuts the promise of the traditional nude. A realist aesthetic is about seducing the viewer with something that approximates life. This is something that has the kind of feel of a fantasy, and also states the naturalness of female nudity and male spectatorship. So the other difference is the model, who was used for a series in the 1920s, and also her averted gaze. I think what's really striking about the Lovell picture is how she kind of engages with you. She looks straight back at you. But I think that the shift, the averted gaze, this makes this more about interiority as well as sensuality. So what's interesting is that the other nude, the third unfinished nude, which is also from this period, this is a double-sided canvas that shows the same model as this one here. And so it's very like the drawing at Reading. But she is completely undressed, as you can see. She doesn't have the necklace or the shawl. And the fact that this painting, a more standard rendering of the nude, remained unfinished, suggests that these additional details were critical to John. There are attempts to subtly remake the ideas telegraphed by the nude, evoking a thinking, embodied woman rather than a two-dimensional masculine fantasy. So in other words, the dressing of the nude was something that I think is quite essential to John. So as with Nude Girl and the unfinished nude from the 1920s, Seated Nude has a companion portrait in which the model is clothed, woman with arms crossed. The sustained interest in these pairings puts John in dialogue with Francisco Goya, whose paintings, The Nude Matcher and The Clothed Matcher, are a clear reference point, as noted actually by a contemporary review by Wyndham Lewis in 1946. So Goya's nude shows a woman lying seductively on a green divan, meeting the viewer's gaze with a forthright expression. In the partner painting, the same woman wears a sheer white dress and yellow jacket. As a pair, the paintings enact the undressing of the model, offering the viewer access to different points in sexual congress, the flirtation and the triumphant conquest. In her exaggeratedly seductive pose, Goya constructs a female sexuality that is unbridled by propriety, as potent clothed as it is unclothed. So I think that John is kind of citing and subverting this, this source and is kind of redirecting things in terms of the focus on male pleasure. But I also think that she's responding to contemporary reworkings of this particular, this idea of the sort of dressing and undressing of the nude by British artists that she would have known and would have exhibited with, people like Walter Sickert and Spencer Gore. So these artists painted women in London's rented rooms in stages of undress that conveyed intimacy and suggest a kind of narrative rather than a static image of sexual display. They are in effect attempts to condense Goya's two paintings into a single frame. These paintings of women washing and dressing invited men to observe women's everyday routines. And these settings rented rooms that were associated at the time with casual sex and sex work. So what these British examples share with Goya is the location of the nude in a woman's bedroom, offering this kind of vicarious thrill of transgressing a secluded domesticity. These are spaces that aren't normally available to men. You don't get to see into other women's rooms. I think that this is part of what's supposed to be kind of erotic about it. So in all of these paintings, the viewer enters a room in which a woman waits, more or less seductively. However, I don't think, that John is doing something. I don't think John's women are waiting. She's very much emphasizing the sitter's self-possession. She waits for no one. She is seated upright. Her lower body is concealed in an austere setting without explicit connotations of sex. Indeed, these feel like studio settings. And I think it's very deliberate to put these in the studio and sort of outside of the home. So while Goya's paintings present the female body in a narrative of seduction, John uses the same bipartite structure to achieve a dramatic ambiguity consistent with women's complex subjectivities. So rejecting the genre's focus on ownership and domination, John's nudes possess their own eroticism, and eroticism in the kind of broadest sense as a kind of quality of aliveness. Close attention to light effects on Lovell's body draw the viewer closer. Color is built up in smoothly painted thin layers, and this is a kind of exercise in duration as much as delicacy that creates a subtle atmosphere of tenderness. The glint of her silver cross evokes the sensation of cool metal against bare skin and encourages the eye down to Lovell's breasts, their curving triangular shape echoed in the cross's chain. In the 1924 nude, soft brushwork intertwines sight and touch. A warm color palette, accentuated by the shadowless illumination of the space, creates a sense of ease and contentment and conveys the sensuality of two bodies close in a room. In the 1909 nude, the shawl is carefully rendered with an expressive fold where the fabric meets Lovell's stomach, echoing the shape of her curled hand. Fabric around the model's pubic area is a reminder that the full disclosure of the model's body has already happened in private. And this detail, I think, is less about virtue than about refusal. Lovell cannot be wholly possessed by the viewer. John's nudes exude a restrained sexuality that acknowledges the desires and desirability of the sitters without capitulating to the male gaze. So John's oblique representation of female desire worked against this tradition, as well as a bourgeois respectability that subjected women's sexuality to censure and shame. And I think it's also worth mentioning that John was bisexual, and I think wrote about this relatively openly in her letters. And I think that this does instill these paintings with a kind of queer subtext that makes their understated eroticism all the more daring. So the final thing I'm going to talk about are drawings. So not just the drawing in the collection at Reading, but there's quite a body of work by John on paper. And really interestingly, this is where most of the experiments of the nude happen. So in a society in which women's chastity was prized and their sexuality understood only in relation to reproduction, it's not surprising that John's more daring and free depictions of the female body emerged in the largely private medium of drawing. John's drawn nude self-portraits, two partially detailed with watercolor, originate from the same year that she painted Nude Girl. So this self-portrait from 1909, I think, was being, these studies, and there's quite a number of them, there's maybe 10 or 12, these were all painted at exactly the same time that she was painting Lovell, which I think is very interesting. So in this drawing, John examines her body before a mirror, her head bowed into a sheet of paper, absorbed in drawing. Nude, she remains an active creative self, not an inert physical presence. White watercolor creates a halo around her head and shoulders as though to visualize thought, which persists despite the heightened awareness of her physicality. Her body is not overtly sexualized. John records what she sees with an unsensational eye. However, I think it's interesting that she includes pubic hair, an aspect of women's naked bodies that was rarely depicted in nudes because, as John Berger notes, hair is associated with sexual power. This covert sexual charge characterizes the other nude self-portrait from 1908 to 1909, the self-portrait nude sitting on a bed. Pale blue watercolor tints her breasts, stomach, and face, while her eyes, nose, and mouth are described with just the lightest bit of gray, adding light, weight, and texture to these parts alone. The rest of her body is outlined in pencil, the apricot-colored paper imitating skin. John accentuates parts of herself imprinted with desire, zones of pleasure, and sensitivity. So as you can see, this is again just a selection of some of the on-paper nudes in the archive. And again, very interestingly, most of these nudes are standing models in different poses. So these women reveal John's continued effort to present the nude as an active, intelligent, and shifting female self. These drawn nudes, I think also very interestingly for me, feel quite playful. And as a result, they add a kind of emotional depth and variety, a sort of subterranean life to the painted nudes, which in common with quite a lot of John's work can feel somewhat somber and austere. There's something kind of amazing and quite shocking if you know John's work to see something like this, a doodle in which a woman's leg sort of transforms into a head. I can't quite tell if it's a man or a woman, but again, it sort of shows her in a slightly more playful mode. And it's interesting to think of that freedom being associated with the body in some sort of sense. I think what's interesting about these sketches too is that they also gesture to all of the work that went into the two finished nudes, the attempts at different poses, the decisions and choices made about hairstyle, facial expression, body language, all sorts of possible accessories. So it's interesting that John only arrived at the near identical compositions through a lot of thought and experimentation. So even though there's only two finished nudes, I get the sense that John was ceaselessly thinking about the genre. In her sketchbook, John searches for alternative sources for this fresh form of the nude. A study of an antique marble in the Louvre, the basis of Rodin's Spirit of Eternal Repose, shows an upright, lithe nude with masculine and feminine features. The figure's non-dimorphic gendered embodiment refuses norms about female bodies and beauty proposed by the nude and corresponds with John's quietly radical collection of drawn and painted interventions in the genre. So I think it's interesting to see this standing female nude that's in the collection at the British Council as being, again, an attempt to sort of think through what would a nude be like that was kind of freed from these overly sexual, overly kind of masculine ideas about female sexuality. What if there could be something that was freed from the gender binary altogether? Yeah, thank you.